the pleasure of having the keynote of Benoît Thiolin, who is the president of the Conseil National du Numérique, the French Digital Council. Then we will have a presentation of the recommendations on terms of service and human rights that will be also discussed at the main session on dynamic coalition outcomes. Then we will have a high-level panel discussion with Marcel Leonardi, who is Director of Public Policy at Google Brazil, Veridiana Limonti, who is a Brazilian lawyer and also works for Intervozes, who is a Brazilian NGO. And I will co-moderate. My name is Luca Belli. I'm a researcher at Center for Technology and Society in Rio de Janeiro. And I will co-moderate with Nicola Zingales, who is a professor at Tilburg, and Primavera De Filippi, who is a researcher at CELSA and Berkman Center. So I think we could start with we can start with the keynote by Joe Kanatachi. Can we use some slides, please? Okay, so let's start with the keynote of Benoît Thiolin while we arrange the PowerPoint presentation. So, Benoît, the floor is yours.
It will be a keynote, just a speech. First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I'm pleased to represent the French, as you say, Digital Council on this 10th Internet Governance Forum. It's also for me an honor to be here with the first UN Special Rapporteur for Privacy, a position which I know has been called for by several freedom advocates. And I'm particularly pleased also to attend a session of the Dynamic Coalition. I want to salute your ambition to move things forward in a participative approach and to do and not to resign ourselves to the idea that digital governance should mean inertia. Indeed, there is an urgent need for intelligent decision process given the magnitude of the challenges and controversies we all face, such as government surveillance and the growing desires to control cryptography. We are coming out of the 20th century with kind of techno-enthusiasm. The digitalization of our world is creating complex changes to which we have to give meanings, direction, and values. 40 years after the invention of the internet, more than 25 years after the web, a plurality of possible worlds is apparent. For instance, I'm convinced that digital and ecological transitions are the most critical issues of our time. The first one has found its path, but not its horizon. The second one has a horizon, but hasn't found a path yet. An increasing number of issues extending far beyond internet governance will need to be addressed at an international level. In this context, I think it is crucial to elaborate a flexible and open governance framework in which civil society, academic networks, technical community, and businesses' voice can be taken into account. Big techs are part of this moving landscape, including Google, whom I thank for being here today. They can and must be our allies, the allies of citizens and their freedoms, rights. They can be. Some of them have already demonstrated a positive contribution to individuals' empowerment as knowledge disseminators, channels for new forms of expression, and channel of citizen mobilization, sometimes across borders. It is in their interest because their business relying on reputation and their trust relation with customers, especially in a disruptive economy where a challenger can use a failure to install trust to differentiate itself. And indeed, they have to renew that trust after the Snowden shock. How can it be? For us, the French Digital Council, it implies to demand platform loyalty. Let's make a semantic digression first. I do not feel comfortable with the term of GAFA that we, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, that we use a lot in Europe and especially in France, because it kind of restricts the debate on a EU-US tone. It makes us forget that these business players have developed hyper-competitive development models that takes full advantage of digital attributes, network effects, outsourced innovation, data exploitation, etc. This model is at the heart of enterprise transformation and changes their value chains. Tomorrow, my bank, my insurer, even the company that manages the bus I take in the morning will integrate platform functions. That is why it is so important to reassess our regulation schemes and ask ourselves if we are equipped for the platformization of our economy. We started to work on online platforms after our very first opinion of net neutrality, in favor of which we took a strong position, as it is essential for ensuring freedom of communications and also free enterprise in the information society. In the same opinion, the Council noted that digital society doesn't only consist of actual networks and pipes. ISP are not the only gatekeepers of the Internet. Online platforms also play a crucial role in the access to information society. Therefore, we should ensure that while they expand, online platforms do not hamper the use of the Internet as a forum for creation, free expression, and the exchange of ideas. We then organized 2 consultations during which issues were raised on both business to business and also business to user level. Users suffer from an unbalanced situation in terms of information. Let's be honest, it is clearly impossible to be sure of what is going to be done precisely with my personal data after they have been collected. These value chains are too much opaque and terms of services are often unreadable for an average human. Business users can suffer from the intermediate position of platforms in the digital environment. It raises classical computation issues, but it occurs in different places. The first result page of a search engine, the technical parameters of an API, etc., which is strong technical lawyer. The subject has continued to grow since then. Twitter recently apologized to developers that were dependent of its API after it shut access to most resources. And the Volkswagen scandal continues to raise concerns about regulators' indigence towards extreme technification of their observation subjects. We have proposed to demand platform loyalty, which means both accountability and fairness. In a technological, rapidly changing service environment, platforms should say clearly what they do what they say, and provide means to verify that it is true. Our consultation with the French businesses involved in the Google search case has shown the need to objectify the difficulties facing professional and individual users of platforms. In fact, it involves a wide range of expertise, interface design, technical skills, etc. It cannot be assured only by lawyers. What is lacking today is a space for collective intelligence in order to objectify and give visibility to online platform practices, whether good or bad. We are convinced that in an audience economy, regulation should be more social and pushed by the market. Crowd vigilance must be encouraged and fully integrated into regulation schemes. The French Digital Council proposed to create a network of rating bodies to evaluate the practices of digital services. It must rely on an open network of contributors by offering a canal for information feedback and federating the wide variety of potential expertises. An app developer confronted to the instability of an API, an app editor facing an opaque referencing policy, consumers association, etc., and even a service user who encounters problems to enforce its rights. There are already numerous initiatives that do a part of the job and that should be given full support in terms of visibility and cooperation. For instance, Terms of Service Didn't Trade is a browser plugged in developed by a law student that rates from A to E the terms of services of most of online services. Am I giving a license on my share consent to the platform operator? Are my data shared with a third party? Can I easily have my data back for personal use, etc.? Dark patterns focus on bad practices relying on interface design and user process through the lens of a web developer. We find this approach very important as it allows to enlighten practices which are not illegal per se, but can contribute to hamper the exercise of our rights if they are done in a larger scale. We propose that those ratings bodies develop comparison criteria embracing both B2B and C2C relationships. Data portability must be one of them, as it is key to ensure people's informational self-determination in the era of big data and IoT. Our proposals have been taken into account by the French government in terms of transparency requirement towards consumers. The idea of reputation level and crowdsourced observation has also been fruitful. At an European level, we began interaction with our German counterparts since we saw that there were shared understanding. For instance, Germany has already put in place a Marktwarte Digitale Welt in charge of monitoring online practices toward individuals and professional users. We also exchange a lot with the European Commission on these issues, and they changed recently. To conclude, I would like to say that there is a very, very strong need for commitment of international players on that issues. They can and must show how it is possible to enforce our rights without holding a low doctorate, just as easy as it is to use a well-designed app without a PhD in computer science. I hope this event will help things to move forwards. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Benoit, for this enlightening presentation, and also for highlighting that not only terms of service should be clear, but also the practices behind terms of service should be quite clear. Now, I would like to ask to Joe Kanatachi to provide us some inputs for reflection. I know that you are going to speak about parallel universes, so I really look forward to hear.
Yes. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, when I asked Luca, what do you want me to speak about? He said, well, you know, this is about platforms, right? And how platforms can help human rights along. And I said, fine. So actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to steal bits of a presentation that I've given before, but which hasn't been broadcast. So, and I'm going to change and I've changed a few bits of it. But let me first ask you to dream, right? Let me ask you to dream of an internet where you have different spaces. At this moment in time, we have different places. But think about spaces. And think about a space where your human rights are respected. Think about a space where there are no problems with jurisdiction. And think about a space where territoriality is not an issue. And think about a space where if you're really upset at somebody because not only have they infringed on your privacy, but they have damaged your reputation. And remember that Article 17 of the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights not only speaks about privacy. Some people only see the part about privacy, but it also speaks about protection of reputation. And a lot of research we've carried out in many projects over the past years have have also shown that people not only care about privacy, but they're very worried what's happening on the internet and their reputation. And I'm taking this opportunity also to tell you something about the mapping project, right? Which is an EU-funded project which we have going on. So, yes, sometimes I will make reference to some of my thinking as a special rapporteur. But I'd like to start with a disclaimer, right? The following views are my own, right? They do not represent the views of the mapping consortium. And it is intended as a pièce provocatrice, right? It's intended to provoke comment and argument. And it also does not necessarily represent my views as special rapporteur, right? I'm just being, just thinking out loud with you. And then I propose to come back, and please ask me, if you're going to ask me any questions, tell me, Joe, I'm going to ask you a question, and so far as your own thinking is concerned, in mapping or else as a special rapporteur. Okay. And if you've heard me speak over the past couple of days, you know that I've been speaking about an international treaty. And no, I'm not going to speak about an international treaty. Because to me, the law is only one part of the solution. International law is only one part of the solution. And those of you who have heard me speak before also know that I also believe that there is a technical dimension to the solution, which is one of the reasons I believe why we're meeting here to talk about platforms. And yes, I'm going to talk about holy cows, right? So when we talk about holy cows, with all due respect to those people who believe in holy cows, I'm just simply using this as a figure of speech, and no disrespect meant to people who consider house to be holy. And I'm going to quickly leave some stuff to one side, and there you are. Because I wanted to come to this particular holy cow. The fuss about one internet, right? Have you noticed how many people like to talk about there is one internet, as if there's one platform? And I'm sorry, but that part of me, which is still a bit of a technical geek, questions a number of facts. Do we have one internet? Are IP4 and IPv6 no longer different protocols? Because my computer requires an interpretation mechanism for them to talk to each other. I would have loved to have Windsurf here to confirm the technical issues, but as far as I'm concerned, we already have two internets, right? And in fact, then some countries, which I shall not name, but some countries have decided to shut off spaces in their part of the internet. So when we talk about one internet, I get a bit worried, because to me what is important is, I don't care if there are, frankly, 3 internets, 10 internets. What I care about are the following. 1, can I access 10 internets physically? Can I afford to access 10 internets financially? And more important, as a citizen, speaking as a citizen, are my rights protected on all of those 10 internets? Because if not, then perhaps I would like to have another internet. I'd like to have that internet where, when I sign on, clearly, I am also signing to a space where my rights are protected. And in fact, if you notice, a lot of people tell us, we don't want to have one internet that way. They tell us, today we have a fragmented internet. And then when I look at fragmented, and I've put this side by side, right? An unfragmented, interconnected, interoperable, secure, stable, resilient, sustainable, and trust-building internet. Now, I have no problem with all the rest of it, but fragmented, unfragmented, so perhaps this is semantics, perhaps it's a figure of speech, but frankly, do I really care if it's fragmented? I mean, wasn't the whole idea about the internet to have a whole bunch of things which are fragments, which I can then go from one thing to another and go together? So the idea of fragmentation, and the word, of course, I'm clearly asking, simply as a figure of speech, is fragmentation a holy cow? Is unfragmented a holy cow? And so far as platforms, technical platforms are concerned too, right? And of course, I ask myself, and I've said so openly, the answer, is an internet treaty the key to completing the puzzle? Is there only one key? And I'm clearly saying no, there isn't only one key. And then we have this phrase, you know, which goes around, the balkanization of the internet. I am going to give a small prize to anybody who finds an earlier version than this, but the balkanization of the internet is, as far as I can trace it, 1997. nearly 20 years old as a phrase. And it's still spoken today as if it's something we want to scare people with, right? And in fact, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. The balkanization of the internet, so on and so forth, into multiple interconnected network families, right? And people have been talking about what I have, and some other people have called parallel universes, right? So I wasn't the first guy who talked about parallel universes. Wayne Cruz, more than nearly 14 years ago, talked about a concept where parallel internets would be run as distinct, private, and autonomous universes. And please find any other way any other word and name that you care for. I'm not wed to parallel universes. I'm not, you can call them, it's almost an insult to the scientists involved, but some people have called other things multiverses if you look at certain parts of astronomy and physics. But what I'm saying here is, should we think about the possibility of using platforms to host a more safe and secure internet? And I'd like to point out to two things so that I won't run out of time. I'd like to point out 2 or 3 things. Some people, like the GNU-net project and similar projects, it's not the only one, are actively examining overlay software which can put on top of IPv4 and IPv6, right? And use these to create a new, more secure space. Some people have also looked at more radical solutions, right? And some people have also talked famously of, why don't we set up, for example, a European internet? Why don't we build something which is not necessarily dependent on servers and routers and switches which we buy from somebody else? And some people have said, well, this may not be such a bad idea. And then you start saying, A, is it feasible? B, is it desirable? And then make it clear. I am not saying either that it's feasible or not it's not feasible. I'm not saying either that it's desirable nor that it's not desirable. I'm saying perhaps we should think about it and see and have a proper discussion about the matter, especially because of the fact if a new technical environment, if new software and or hardware solutions help provide a space where fundamental human rights are better protected, then it's not such a bad idea. And in fact, I'd like to point out 2 things. If I were to wear my other hat, that of UN Special Rapporteur, I would be the first to tell you it's not only privacy, ladies and gentlemen. Fundamental human rights is a whole bunch of other things, including freedom of expression, including the right to access information, including dignity, including reputation. And for all of us in the room and so many outside the room who believe in the power of the internet, then I think it's worthwhile looking more closely and perhaps putting it on the agenda, Luca, of this particular initiative, which I consider to be very worthwhile. Let us have a serious look at technical environments which can help provide something else. Something where if I can sign on to this space, you see, think about it. How many companies have actually relied on your signing on to get you to agree to terms and conditions, but instead stand it on its head? And instead of signing on to terms and conditions, sign on to agree to the rules of a new space. And the rules of that new space should, to my mind, amongst other things, also include affordable remedies for the citizen. Because now, ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a funny kind of society where if I buy something on the internet, especially in certain places where the law has been tightened up. I can buy something on the internet and still have a guarantee. I can buy a phone, electronic equipment, other stuff. But then I turn around and say, is the same thing going to happen to me if I go away from consumer rights and the guarantees that I have, and I go to other things? About 10 years ago, we carried out a study why eBay was so successful. And we considered a number of platforms. And the truth of the matter is, one of the reasons, of course, some people would say it's the main reason, is trust. And trust there was especially engendered by remedies, right? Anybody who has been following what I've been saying during this IGF 2015 will know that I have talked about, okay, the reality is that we have an internet without borders, and therefore citizens expect safeguards without borders and remedies across borders. And that is precisely what the dispute resolution mechanism that eBay and similar services offer. It's that you have a quick, easy, and relatively cheap way of solving a dispute. And now think about something else, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a problem with privacy or reputation on the internet, and you take that to a court, not an online court, but an offline court. In many countries, and in some more than others, that's going to cost you tens of thousands, in some countries, hundreds of thousands of euro or pounds or sterling to resolve. And yet, we have online dispute resolutions systems for a number of things, including intellectual property, including top-level domain names, including whole areas which WIPO has successfully put together. So if we managed to do this in, other areas, can't we also manage to do this for reputation and privacy? But won't we need laws for that? And that is where we bring structures in. I don't have the time to go through all this because I'd like to respect the time we have, and I'm running out. My message ends here. My message is, while technically a parallel, my message is please think about what I'm going to say, more than taking it as any form of definitive and concrete conclusion. While technically a parallel internet could be distinct and autonomous, unlike what Wayne said, it does not need to be private, right? It could be public. It could be a common good. And it could be just as accessible as other parts of the internet. Only it may play by a different set of rules. And those rules could be built into the platform itself. And I feel that for one reason or another, not enough attention has been given to platforms providing this approach, right? And the only thing I'll say, and please forgive me if I'm making a tiny plug here, we are, in the mapping project, actually also looking at parallel universes. So if you're interested in contributing to the debate, please speak to me after the session, and we can explain more what we're doing, and you might want to contribute there in the growing dialogue that we have in finding technical safeguards which complement human rights safeguards, which complement legal safeguards in what could be a brave new world. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for letting us dream about safe, human-friendly universes, and also to remind us that technological solutions can allow those friendly, human rights compatible environment. So before getting to the presentation of the recommendations, I would like to welcome Patrick Pennings, who is the director of the Council of Europe Information Society Department, and then I will allow Nico to start and present the first part of the recommendations.
Thanks, Luca. And thank you very much, Joe, for the very enlightening presentation where you actually focus precisely on what we are trying to do here, which is to create some baseline, some rules of engagement that can be used to foster a responsible behavior by platforms, so a safer space, as you were pointing out. So actually in this recommendation that you should have, or if you haven't got a copy, you can find it on the table on the left side. We try to develop these recommendations in a participatory manner through a mailing list. This is a work that has been going on for almost a year. And we based our work on existing human rights documents. So we looked first of all at what was a minimum required according to those international documents. But we didn't stop there. We also looked into what are responsible ways to carry out the values that those documents were trying to protect in a responsible manner. So we developed some best practices. So in the paper that you can see, there is a distinction between shall and should. When you have shall, we are referring to minimum standards. Sorry for the lawyerly comment, but it's quite important from a legal perspective. When you instead focus on should, and it's something that platforms could do to show the way, in a way to more responsible behavior. So one problem that we faced in doing this is that sometimes national laws might be in conflict with these best practices. Simply because international human rights documents can be implemented on a national level in a slightly different way. So to that extent, we included in the definition something that we call legitimate law, which refers to the fact that the platform can sometimes use this as an excuse. So saying, I'm complying with something that was imposed to me nationally, but this is not sufficient. We argue that it should be a legitimate law, so it should come through a democratic process, and substantively it should also be legitimate in the sense that it's not disproportionate to address the pressing social need that it's supposed to address, indeed. So letting that aside, that you can look into more detail by looking at the documents, we will also present this in the next 2 days over the main session for dynamic coalitions, where we are seeking the validation by the broader IGF community. I will start by simply telling you a couple of introductory remarks about due process, which is another lawyerly term which maybe is not apparent to everyone. And then I will leave the floor to Luca and Primavera to talk about privacy and freedom of expression. So with regard to due process, what do we mean? In this document, at least, we refer to 3 basic values. The first of all the values is clarity, and this is what we try to foster with the terms of service. So if you don't know exactly what the law is, you have some problems in complying with the law. So first of all, as a user, it's important to know what the law of the platform is. So this is the first value. The second is a right to an effective remedy. So you should always have within the platform the opportunity to have an appeal or a review of the decisions that are being taken concerning you. And the third one is the right to be heard. So there should be a consultation whenever the platforms take a measure that can impact on you, not only individually but also broadly as a user of the platform. For example, changes of contractual terms. So in doing that, we divided the section on due process in 2 parts. One is amendment and termination of contracts, and the second is adjudication. Amendment termination of contracts mainly refers to the need to have meaningful notice before there is any significant change in the terms of service or any termination of the service. And secondly, with regard to adjudication, platforms should, as it was also mentioned by the previous speaker, provide alternative quick dispute resolution mechanisms in order to have rights effectively protected. However, this mechanism should not replace the courts of law, should be only an addition and not a substitute. So in particular, platforms should not impose waivers of access to court or class actions. This is again another best practice that we encourage, although it's not strictly required by law. And looking forward to discuss this more in detail over the course of the next 2 days. Please pick up a copy if you haven't, and I'll pass it over to Primavera, I think.
So with regard to privacy, we have the data collection. So the platform operator should limit the collection of personal data to what is directly relevant and necessary to accomplish a specific, clearly defined and explicit communicated purpose. And in particular, the platform should specify every type or category of information collected rather than requiring a general purpose consent. And then if consent is withdrawn, then the operator should prevent any further processing on the individual data by the controller. Then after consent is given, the platform should always provide a way for user to opt out at a later stage, and it should also allow users to view, to copy, to modify, and to delete the personal information that have been made available. With regard to data retention, the platform operator should clearly communicate in their terms of service whether and for how long they have been storing the personal data. With regard to data aggregation, the aggregation of platform user data should only be done subject to express consent, and the purpose of the data aggregation, as well as the nature of the new data resulting from the aggregation, should be clearly stated in order to allow the platform user to properly understand the scope of the given consent. With regard to data used, the platform should obtain consent in order to use personal data for the legitimate purpose and for the duration specified in the terms of service. And it is also recommended that the platform specify in the term of service that the processing of personal data is limited to the scope of the existing service, which means that the enrollment of the platform user in any new service should require all the time an acceptance of a new terms of service. The platform operator should also give user the possibility to demand the rectification of any inaccurate data and to object to any usage of this data unless it is mandated by legitimate law. And then finally, the platform operator should always permit their user to delete their account in a permanent fashion. And if there is no other legal reason justifying the further storage of the data processor should proceed to the permanent deletion of all or portion of the relevant data associated with the platform user account in a time that is reasonable for its technical implementation. And then finally, with regard to the data protection vis-à-vis third parties, the platform operator should establish clear mechanisms for platform users to gain access to all of their personal data held by a third party and to whom their data has been transferred, as well as to be informed of the actual usage thereof. The platform operator should also allow users to preserve their anonymity with regard to third parties to the extent that is permitted by legitimate laws. And then it is also recommended that platform enabled end-to-end encryption of communication and other personal information in the context of both storage and transmission. And then finally, as regards the handling over to platform user data to government requests, the platform operator should specify that they execute such requests only in the presence of a valid form of legal process and should release periodic transparency report providing all the amount and the type of such requests for each jurisdiction in which they operate.
Thank you, Primavera, for this. So the third very important, I would say, core part of these recommendations is freedom of expression. And so we all know that platforms' terms of service may have a very deep effect on the possibility of the users to freely seek, impart, and receive informations. And that possibility may be limited, hindered either by the platform terms of service or by the applicable legitimate law. So in the recommendations, we tried to provide guidance, similar guidance on these two main issues, starting from the departure of the basic consideration that platforms are increasingly a sort of speech enabler. They allow people to express themselves, but they are also an enabler of information seeking. So they allow to find information, and they are an increasingly essential intermediary to find information. So we divided in the first part. We are dealing with limitation due to terms of service, and it is understandable that a private space could have limitations, but those limitations should be clearly stated in the terms of service, and those limitations should also provide effective remedies to challenge a decision that may not be in compliance with the terms of service. So the first part is to clearly allow the user to know what kind of limitations he has when using the platform, and the second one is to have a remedy, an effective remedy when these limitations is abused. And then in the second part, we deal with content takedown or restrictions that are imposed by the law, and this is something that could happen, but these kind of restrictions should be necessary and proportionate to achieve the goals of a legitimate law. And Nico was explaining before how have we defined the legitimate law, and also when also in this case, when content is taken down, the users should always have the possibility to have a remedy, so to seek redress, both within the platform, but just as a complement of the existing court system that should always be available. So without further explaining this part, which is a very important part, but I'm sure we will have the possibility to discuss this with our panelists, I would like to open our third segment of the session, and I think it may be interesting, knowing that we're speaking about freedom of expression, to start with Patrick Pennings. We know that the Council of Europe is doing and has been doing excellent work on freedom of expression, and I would like to ask you, Patrick, what could be the effect that terms of service may have on internet users' rights? And we know that the Council of Europe has recommended a guide on internet users' rights only last year. And what is the role of state in order to enforce this right and protect this right?
Does it work? Yeah, it works. Thank you, Luca. Thank you also for the question, and thank you for inviting the Council of Europe to this very interesting debate. I think you already mentioned, first of all, our human rights guide for the internet user. That you have to see it's not just a recommendation, it is a soft law instrument that is adopted by 47 member states of the Council of Europe. In that sense, it becomes a crucial guiding principle for our member states. It's also clear that the role of platforms, service providers, intermediaries are extremely important, and I would even say that our courts, including the European Court of Human Rights, is still seeking for guidance as to where it should place itself with regards to the role of these intermediaries. That's why and I see some people laughing, I think it's extremely important that we are able to give and provide more guidance on this. That's why one of the reasons why I decided we cooperate with the Vargas Foundation to look into the terms of reference and terms of service together in the light of this human rights guide for the internet user. But we're not limited to that. We need to go a step further. I think on the one side it's extremely important that we do not create a multitude of courts and judges with regards to what should be put and what should be taken out of some of these terms of references, and not leave a completely open space as to a development in a multitude of directions with regards to the protection of human rights through these terms of reference of the service providers and intermediaries. So that's extremely important. We're still at a searching stage at this point in time. That's why what we will be doing, and that's where this type of recommendation actually comes in very handy for us. It also is very much in time, because over the next 2 years we will be looking very precisely into the role of intermediaries and service providers. I just quote from our own Council of Europe Internet Governance Strategy that will be adopted by our Committee of Ministers in a couple of weeks' time, well, at the latest at the beginning of 2016. One of the things it says, and I read, we will establish a platform between governments and major internet companies and representative associations on the respect for human rights online, including on measures such as model contractual arrangements for the terms of service of internet platforms and principles of accountability and transparency to the multi-stakeholder community regarding the collection, storage and analysis of personal data to protect, respect and remedy challenges on violations to them. So I think you're fully in line with what we intend to produce, and it will certainly be an element of consideration when we start working on this. As I mentioned, we will have a specific committee composed of governments but also of experts to focus on this and develop that in the next 2 years actually, in terms of very specific recommendations, and any orientation on that will be extremely helpful. I will keep it at that. We can still discuss it afterwards in more detail.
Thanks a lot, Patrick, also for the very good news about the Council of Europe work on this precise topic. So, Nico, I think you can keep on.
I find actually interesting that this can be used as a base for further policy making, at least thinking about new recommendations that maybe can be adopted at a more institutional level. In this regard, I think it's also interesting to mention we had a spin-off project as part of this dynamic coalition that was looking into terms of service, and this was what you mentioned, I believe, referred to the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. We were lucky to actually have a consultation on the implementation of the Marco Civil and the reform of data protection law running at the same time, and we were able to provide some statistics, for example, on these terms of service of main online platforms during the process of negotiation at the Parliament. But also I found interesting that you mentioned two representative organizations for users being active in this debate. In this regard, we are lucky to have someone from a major consumer organization in Brazil, and I would like to know how do you see this recommendation potentially playing an interesting role, guiding role for you at the Brazilian level?
Thanks. Well, good afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank the invitation to discuss the recommendations here. I'm Veridiana, and I work at Intervozes, with a Brazilian NGO that works with to promote diversity and plurality in media and internet, as well as the respect of human rights. And before that, I worked in a Brazilian organization that worked directly with consumer rights. So firstly, I would like to highlight the relevant work of this dynamic coalition in developing these recommendations that can be adopted as best practices by the companies and taken into regard by governments in their internal and external policies and legislations. As the recommendations itself stresses, the digital environment is characterized by ubiquitous intermediation. Increasingly, the operation of these platforms affects individuals' ability to develop their own personality and engage in a substantial amount of social interactions. And this is happening more and more through global platforms with global users, which raises the need for the establishment of global values and standards based on participative processes and, of course, having human rights as a fundamental common and minimum ground. About this, even though we are in an international level discussions, I think that the national experiences and concerns can help us to deal with this international challenge. One important regulation in Brazil is the Consumer Defense Code that ensures the right to information as a basic right. Choices cannot be made, consent cannot be provided, services cannot be properly used if there is not an absolutely transparent relationship between the user and the service provider, from the moment that this provider announces its services. Other important pillar of this law is the acknowledgement of the inequality between user and the supplier of products and services, considering abusive or unfair, and therefore no obligations or clauses that give exaggerated benefits to the provider or the supplier. It's important for us in national level this way to deal with unfair and abusive obligations and clauses, because it does not matter whether they are written or not in the adhesion contracts, which, willingly or not, is what the terms of services are. So it's important to have minimum grounds that the companies should meet, but if they don't meet, we have these grounds that can be also enforced by national and international legislation to give us this kind of enforcement. On the more specific proposals for the 3 themes or issues focused on the platform, on the recommendations, I would like to bring a problematic Brazilian experience to comment the freedom of expression provisions. We have in Brazil a restrict copyright legislation with few exceptions and limitations to copyright protection, far from the access to knowledge concerns that we discuss in forums as IGF. Moreover, many times the argument of copyright violation is used to justify the removal of a critical content that uses, for example, a company's audiovisual production to criticize its editorial line. When the Dynamic Coalition's recommendations deal with restrictions to freedom of expression, the main criteria, as was said, is that these restrictions shall be explicitly defined by a legitimate law, and there is an exercise to evaluate if this law is legitimate or not only by the fact that if it's written or not in national legislation, and if it's the process of approving was a democratic one. But even though this evaluation of legitimacy is submitted for different references, even regarding national legislation, depending the level of this analysis. In order to give more elements for this analysis, I think, as a suggestion, that it would be important that the recommendations mentioned copyright fair use or the fair use standards to face national legislation that doesn't take this into consideration. Regarding privacy, the platform addresses many important concerns with guarantees that we still don't have in Brazil, even with Marco Civil, considering that we are late in approving our data protection law despite significant advances in this direction this week. About this, it is interesting to stress that Marco Civil introduced the purpose principle in our legal system. However, it's not simple to enforce this principle in the face of generic justifications of better provision or current or future services. In this sense, and concerned with the concretization of the purpose and necessity principles. I think that it would be important for us to discuss if this part of the recommendations should be a shall or a should, because I think this is the core of the concretization of the purpose principle and the necessity principle. But despite of these brief comments, I reaffirm my congratulations and compliments for the fantastic work done, which is pretty important for us. And to finish, just to use the floor that I'm having here, and very briefly, I just wanted to comment, because what happened yesterday, well, yesterday when 2 members of my organization were taken from IGF for raising banners criticizing free basics, part of internet.org project, and defending net neutrality during the opening ceremony. I think that most of you saw it or would known about it. I would like to just inform that this decision was reversed this morning after negotiations that showed the disproportionate character of such reaction. And although we are at an UN territory, and these are proceedings for the UN meetings in general, what we were not aware, IGF is different from high-level conferences. That's what we think among states representatives, and the right to demonstrate should be part of this democratic, participative, and multi-stakeholder process. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, certainly. And thank you very much for the comments on the recommendation. They will duly be taken into account. I'm taking the fact that actually you mentioned fair use to then move to the other side of the table, because so far we've been speaking about platforms, but we haven't heard the voice of one of them, and this is a major improvement from last year, where we didn't manage to get any representation from the platforms. So Marcel Leonardi, it's a pleasure to have you here from Google. And I would like to ask you, do you think that terms of service can also, in a way, serve as a supplement to transparency reports in explaining how you carry out your specific responsibilities? For example, in the case of takedown requests, how you assess, whether there is fair use, and similarly with regard to right to be forgotten, which criteria are going to be taken into account. It would be nice if users could know them. Now, there is a catch there that if you have everything in terms of service, they become very long. Right. I believe that you can also achieve a midway by having expandable drop-down in terms of service or referring to other documents. But I will be interested in hearing what you think.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, part of yet another IGF. On behalf of Google, I'd like to thank the panelists for inviting me. I'd like to know, I'm really glad that we avoided an all-male panel for starters. And yeah, and of course, I really appreciate the amount of work that was done to get this project off the ground. I mean, the amount of things, this kind of work is really a massive undertaking. Not only this particular initiative, but all of the other initiatives that we have seen. I see Bertrand over there with his Internet and Jurisdiction project, which is absolutely fantastic work. The Ranking Digital Rights that was presented earlier today, and several other similar projects really help companies like Google to actually understand what the concerns of its users are. That's why I slightly disagree with the idea of being on the other side of the table, because I believe we are on the same table. We just sometimes we share some meals, sometimes we quarrel a little bit. But carrying on to what you asked, and then I'll delve into some of the comments that I have on the work itself. It's very hard for a company to draw very specific lines on content takedown, for example. What really is complicated for any company like Google, especially in an environment across the world, I'll take Brazil as an example, which is obviously my home turf. The more generic the law tends to be, the harder it is to draw any kind of specific line. And that's the same idea in terms of service and implementations. People might know or may not be aware that, for example, Brazil has criminal provisions on defamation, on offense to the honor of a person, that kind of thing. And what companies like Google face on a daily basis is essentially a dispute over what exactly those terms mean. So we get, for example, court orders saying that criticism of a particular political figure or people shouting at each other online or some reason, whether it offends or it is a defamatory problem. And I guess that translates a little bit, but then we have the judges to actually say, well, this is not. I guess that translates a little bit to how terms of service operate as well. It's just as you said, we try to create some specific guidelines to the extent that we are able to, but obviously they're always open to interpretation. So the way this works internally, at least speaking for Google, is essentially teams look at each and every request for content takedowns, to take the example of content takedowns, and try to ascertain not only if whatever request comes up is within the spirit of the terms of service, but also bound to what local legislation provides. And I guess that's part of the key challenge that companies face in that sense, and that's why work like yours is so important. You guys are trying here to establish international framework, which is precisely what's so hard to achieve in these discussions. I mean, essentially, no company wants to be put in a position that it needs to decide whether complying with local legislation also means throwing their users into a dungeon, into jail. All of you may remember a case from about 10 years ago about what happened to Shi Tao in China, for example. So that's exactly the kind of scenarios I'm talking about. Now, if you allow me some quick comments on regarding the work that has been done, and again, I really appreciate the opportunity to comment and congratulate you again on this massive undertaking. The only points I would raise as part of the private sector would be careful when suggesting this not to just look at the big platforms. I see parts of this document emphasizing, for example, how online platforms are akin to public spaces. I see parts of this document mentioning all of the responsibility that these actors should provide, and that's all well and good when you're talking about Google, Twitter, Facebook, Microsoft, all of the gigantic platforms of the online world currently. But do remind yourselves that these kinds of guidelines will work towards any new platforms as well. And sometimes you may create so many restrictions from the get-go that essentially you are actually regulating innovation out of the space. So even though these are, of course, regulatory provision, not regulatory provisions, they're just recommendations, bear in mind that, because that's obviously something that needs to be addressed. One particular example that I'd like to mention is, let's say some of you disagree with the basic business model of the online world currently, which is essentially lots of free online services that are based on advertising, they're based on behavioral advertising. The fact remains that if the business model of the online world would change from day to night, or night to day if you prefer, not to no longer actually provide these free services, these free platforms, everything was charged, data collection, data aggregation, data usage would still be as necessary as normal. Why? Because of the way this data is combined, the way this data is used to innovate, the way it's used to improve services, to create new platforms, and all of these things. I did see on the website that some comments were provided by the private sector, and I guess my concern is I didn't really see them reflected on the final output. But that's a different matter. In any case, I'll be happy to take any questions. I know people are anxious to ask them. Thank you.
Marcel, so I just want to clarify, I appreciate what you're saying, and we did try our best to incorporate all the comments, and I think the major gap that we had was that we were requiring express or consent for basically any further use of the data whenever there is a change in the purpose, and this is might appear to be in contrast with some recent data protection laws that require processing data also not only on the basis of consent but also on the basis of legitimate interest of the controller or a third party. So we did put that in, but I think Brazilian law is interesting in that respect because the new proposal require this legitimate interest actually to be identified ex ante. So this is something that I would like to ask everyone actually in the panel, starting from you, if you think that in a big data world, it is possible indeed to put in the service terms of service at least the categories of parties with whom those data are going to be shared, and of uses that can be done of the data, even if this requires changing the original purpose.
Marcel, sorry if I interrupt you, but before keeping that question in mind, can we also have maybe 2 questions from the floor so that we can all have... Yeah. Thank you. So, okay, so if does anyone have any questions, comment? If you have them, please be welcome to the... Do we have a roaming mic? Could someone... Okay, we have one there. Perfect. Could you bring the... Yeah, yes, closer.
I'm Parminder from IT for Change, an NGO based in Bangalore. A very interesting panel, and first of all, a very, very useful initiative. Thanks to Luca and others. And I think it's great value in this kind of initiative. It's important to nibble on the corners and make progress. But I just want to, point to one structural fact at the base of everything else. I heard you say one of those recommendations is that no data can be shared other than for the purposes it has been declared, etc. We should realize that there are extreme statements in a positive sense for me, but probably in a negative sense for what it's the engine of today's internet economy. You're talking about taking away the very basic logic of it. And I'm very happy Google did respond to that fact that if you don't do it this way, then you need to figure out which other way. But I'm just pointing to the fact that we are dealing not with just a list of rights, but very the structure of the new economy as we would want to. What sacrifices or compromises we are ready to make, and what kind of value different new possibilities can give. It's possible in a decentralized manner that data can still be used for value creation, which it needs to be used. And there is enough value created, and we make a compromise wherever. But I just want to connect the rights issue to the very heart of the new economic structure. And therefore, you are up against very powerful forces. It's not just signing up a small thing. I have to just say before I end, I was very impressed by Joe's going to the heart of the matter of parallel internet, because it's kind of a technical threat put on you. This is our internet. You want to take it. Otherwise, you're denied the internet. And we all say, no. We want the internet. So then it said, okay, this is the internet. Though it's not a fact, because the technical systems allow us to have other kinds of internet. We are organizing Internet Social Forum, which is a forum of the World Social Forum, which says another world is possible. And the theme of the Internet Social Forum is actually another internet is possible. And I think to at least accept those possibilities makes us think in different technically fragmented manners. Thank you.
I think Chris had a question.
And of course, the balkanization of the internet, we were having an email exchange about this.
Sorry, Chris, can you just introduce yourself for the record?
Oh, I thought you'd done it. Chris Marsden, University of Sussex. The balkanization issue, of course, goes back to NSFNet being privatized and people using CompuServe and AOL and so on. So this is very long-standing. And what I would really like is a platform that I could sign up to, in my case as a European citizen still, hopefully, but also I think for others, a platform that was willing to respect the ICCPR or willing to respect the European Convention on Human Rights. And that's very difficult. In most parts of the business world, if you want to work in a country, you conform to the country's laws. And it's very unusual that we are still, we're now, I believe, 17 years since the case of Felix Somm in Germany, we're 15 years since the Yahoo in France case, and we still find it very difficult to be able to sign up to platforms that will actually observe the laws of our own countries, which are the internationally recognized human rights standards that we would hope that we could get. So I want to support Joe in terms of I would like to see an alternative that actually did respect those human rights, and it is very difficult to discover that. Comments would be welcome.
Thank you for the questions. And now I think maybe we can start with Marcel with his reply, and then all the panelists are obviously welcome to provide replies.
The only intellectual honest answer to your question is yes. Of course companies can do more. Of course companies can do better. Of course they can disclose more information in terms of service. However, for one, there hasn't been any prior pressure to that. There we go. For two, there are obviously some commercial concerns around that. I mean, to what kind of level of detail do we want to go into? Does that borderline goes into trade secrets? Does that borderline go into some partnerships that have to be kept in secret? Or they're because of confidential agreements? So, of course, there's probably more that can be done. However, one thing that's also worth noting is, would that suffice? I guess the general criticism, and you guys didn't really do this, which is very interesting, which is basically you are still acknowledging that terms of service are a useful tool, right? I mean, essentially you want more transparency, you want to know better what companies are doing, that's a great thing. I mean, we may dislike them, we may not read them, but several national laws, Brazil's included, actually state that companies are allowed to collect and use data if they don't violate any other legislation, as long as there's no prohibition on the use of that data, and as long as it's disclosed in the terms of service and the privacy policies. So essentially, I think that's a very good approach in which it allows companies to actually better disclose that kind of information. So I guess the major concern is, one, there hasn't been much pressure, so you can do it. And two, we just have to be careful where we draw the line. But moreover, is it really useful? Would people really be more comfortable if that information was widely available?
Please.
Well, I believe that the pressure may be coming. If we're talking, for example, and that's why in the Council of Europe Open Forum, you will see that we have invited Max Schrems tomorrow. And I think the world, just like after Snowden, the world is not the same after the Schrems decision. I think it's important that we really take that into account. I'm not saying, on the one side, obviously, companies have an intrinsic different goal that we understand. And I think that when we are going to look into the role of the intermediaries, we have to clearly take into account also that business perspective. Business perspective or associations perspective. We really need to take that into account, and maybe we will not be going as far as the dynamic coalition is going. But what is clearly important is that we have to ensure that our citizens, who are also becoming more and more vocal on these issues and more demanding on these issues, that they keep a close eye on how their personal private data, for example, are going to be dealt with, what is going to be done with them, and that there is clarity about that. And I think, indeed, maybe the intermediaries had a little bit of a free hand in that. I don't know, I think it was like 3 seconds that people spent on reading terms of reference when they... Doesn't matter. I think it's crucial that we, as an international community, be able to provide a number of safeguards that are otherwise not provided. And that is what the Council of Europe, as an international institution, stands for. We have to not only protect, but also oblige our states to go into directions that will allow better self-regulation of providers, and that is the way forward. And I think an initiative such as this one rings the alarm bell, and I think that needs to be done and taken seriously into account. Thank you.
I think Joe had also a reply.
Yes, thank you, Luca. I'd like to come in perhaps on 3 different angles. Angle 1 is a point of information. And here I'm not talking on behalf or with results from the mapping project, but following something that Patrick has just said, I want to refer to another project we carried out together with at least one friend and colleague in this room called the Consent Project. And in Consent, we actually went out and spent 3 years trying to find out whether what consent is and whether it works. And Patrick has just said that people spend 3 seconds on average reading it, when they read it. Because our research in Consent and some other projects suggests that between 80 and 85% of people don't read them. And out of those that read them, less than 11% understand what they read. So you are looking at a tiny... So when we're talking about terms and conditions and terms of service, we need to find out, is it a meaningful consent? And to my mind, all the evidence we have suggests it is not meaningful. The second thing that I would like to perhaps draw attention to, and here perhaps I will now put on my hat as a special rapporteur for privacy, is that when we talk about business models, it is not a simple subject at all. And I think that we have to be careful what we wish for, right? Because when you are looking, and I say this with the greatest of respect to our colleagues from Google here, if you look at an operation like Google and you see how it is providing benefits in access to information across the planet, the minute that you start tinkering with, let alone seriously amending the business model, you are going to have impact on people who can afford to pay less and people who can't afford to pay at all. Now, I'm not saying let's not fix the business model. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying let's work together with people like Google and other suppliers, big and small, to understand what the impact is. And I think there's a human rights impact assessment which needs to be carried out. But there's also, when it comes to human rights, there are also accessibility impact assessment which needs to be carried out, and fair information practices assessments which need to be carried out. And I think this is important. I think that one of the things which has been missing is a structured dialogue between the companies and with the companies. Now, when companies, obviously, companies in many cases are there, in most cases are there to make a profit. And in this sense, you can understand that when in discussing their business model, there might be legitimate concerns about discussing those parts of their business model which give them a competitive edge. Fine, fair enough. Let's deal with that. But that doesn't mean that we don't discuss it. That means we discuss it in a different way. And what is worrisome too is that these things take place in fits and starts, which is why I'm so pleased that we have had this second meeting here, and why I look forward to the next ones, because if this is part of a structured dialogue, right, I think that that structured dialogue can eventually lead to better places and better spaces. And the third point I would like to make is on the role of organizations like the Council of Europe and other organizations which can facilitate a structured dialogue at a regional basis, and at the same time then look at how that can be globalized in a way which is going to benefit everybody. So just to give, since we have, I could go on at length, but I'd like to stop here. But since we have Google and the Council of Europe in the room, we'll take that as an example, right? If the Council of Europe has, facilitates, I should say, discussions between various actors and stakeholders, and with Google on various parts of its business model in Europe, which would make it conform more readily to a human rights regime as we would like to see it take place there, then it makes things that much more easy at the global level, because you're dealing with a global company. And I see a huge advantage in that if we're then going to talk about with multi-stakeholder environment in Latin America, in North America, in Southeast Asia, etc. The different perspectives and the different cultural perspectives, ladies and gentlemen, make things come together at a global level in a much easier fashion, because sometimes I'm wary of a one-size-fits-all approach, which may actually threaten the very rights that we are setting out to protect and impose useless restrictions on business models, while at the same time not putting in the right restrictions. I think Marcel has been very honest and say, hey guys, there wasn't that much pressure. We had our eyes on other things, perhaps, right? Now, not only is the pressure there, but it's also legitimate concerns. And may I say it, and I'd like to end on this, it is a great pleasure to me when I see companies use privacy as a USP, as a unique selling proposition. Yeah, come on, get it on. Make your services more privacy friendly. And customers will vote for the feed. Because another thing that I am committed to is increasing awareness of privacy. And if you're going to have a choice between a product which offers you less privacy, but which is just as cost effective, and a product which is offering you more privacy and is even more cost effective, and to that end possibly more profitable, to a certain extent, I'm also suggesting, Marcel, you might want to look at, stack them high, sell them cheap, right? Because if you're going to have a better product, you can have more people, you have more money using your services, more money, and then you can afford to cross-fund services in those areas of the world, especially developing countries where there's less money to be had.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I think that I could speak on behalf of both the co-coordinators and the Dynamic Coalition members, saying that Dynamic Coalition on Platform Responsibility will be more than happy to facilitate this kind of multi-stakeholder dialogue within the IGF, but also beside the IGF, perhaps at the Council of Europe if necessary. So I think that we have another comment.
Yeah, so just a brief comment about the question that dealt with the big data era and our capacity to put in the term of services the uses that we can do with the data usage and the third parties. I think that we have to find this path, because this is the only path that can drive us to really concretize and enforce all the data protection principles that we have in international law, in other national law. There are references, and that we are trying to have here in Brazil. So this is a way to deal with an opposition that, that Parminder said. I think that we didn't should deal with this as a opposition, and I don't think you did it. But we have to try to work in a common path and a common ground with the business models challenges and the rights, the protection of rights, and the economic activity has to be built above this rights protection. And just another comment, important comment about the meaningful, if the terms of services are meaningful or not. I think that they are part of this process, and even the recommendations, they are not only about what is written in the terms of services that a user reads when it starts to use a platform, but even some tools are here to be provided as the tool that to user, for example, be able to redefine the extent of the availability of its data, of their data. So that's why, for me, the discussion about terms of services has to be done in conjunction with the discussion about privacy by design, privacy by default, and how the applications are developed to be able to protect regularly the privacy.
With this, we have time for a couple of more questions. Yes, one in the back, please.
And as we started with 5 minutes of delay, we could finish with 5 minutes of delay, I think, with no problem.
Hi, Valentina Pelitzker from Bosnia. Okay, thanks for bringing the Balkan always in the worst possible light. Never mind, we are used. We live in paradox. I think that consent is something that it's really worth it to analyze and to think of also the ethics. But when we come to corporation, I have the feeling like being the user, the indigenous, and in the land that was not regulated, the cowboys came and took whatever. And now they said that this is the business model that we need to protect and to save in order to maintain the internet. Otherwise, we will lose. And we are what? Indigenous in the reserves. I think that we should not fear and not put the business model all up front. It's a business model that is based on the user's rights, on the user's information, which are a treasure. And big companies as Google and Facebook, which have an incredible amount of money, could experiment or put research for searching for another alternative, more respectful of the user's business model. So please avoid the mantra of business model cannot be rediscussed, and always say, if we rediscuss, you stay out. Because this is the reason why a user spends less than 18 seconds, because it's a take or leave it check-in box.
I think Primavera also wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I have it's a comment and I guess a question, if it can be answered shortly. I think there has been like all this discussion about the consent, so whether the terms of use are actually clear and understandable, and whether the user are actually providing an express consent. And then there has been the question about the business model, so whether it is possible to identify alternative business models that do not rely on the collection and processing on personal data. But it seems to me that there is another point I saw that has not been mentioned, which is this, the growing desire of users to actually benefit from an extremely customized and personalized service, which actually require, to some extent, like intrusive collection and processing of personal data, and which therefore leads users to actually provide consent, even though they actually do understand that it has an impact on their privacy, but they would rather enjoy the personalization of the service. So my question then, and it's a question to all the panel, whoever want to answer, is it actually fair to prevent platform operators from actually providing a more customized service at the expense of what user actually want? So if the user is actually willing to forego its privacy in order to enjoy a personalized service, even though this might actually lead to a potential violation of human rights, can we actually prevent platforms from providing that?
Okay, I guess I'll try to answer that. And to your point as well. So I'm a little bit confused because benefiting the user, obviously people vote with their feet. People vote with their mouths, with their devices, right? I mean, in a way, if you want more private services using the same platforms, most platforms, Google included, obviously have options. If you go to myaccount.google.com, you can configure the service as private as you want. You still see advertising, let's be very, very clear on that, but the advertising will no longer be targeted. You can erase any search history that you might have. You can select that Google will no longer collect any of that information. So on the other hand, how useful would be Google Maps or any other mapping service for that matter without collecting the user's location? So I guess to your point, you're right. It would be possible to develop different business models, but so far the market has not shifted toward those models because there hasn't been user demand. I know that we are at the IGF. Usually this is a community very engaged in privacy discussions, but let's face it, the average user simply doesn't care. It's up to you guys, for companies, for everybody in this room to actually rise to the occasion. It's different in Europe, it's different in Brazil, it's different in the US, but that's what companies are perceiving right now. And my second point would be more related to the second question would be, I think we're seeing new business models creeping up. I mean, you have plenty of services right now that are based on subscription, like things like Netflix, things like Spotify, and yet it kind of validates my earlier point, which is all of these services, despite not having target advertising, at least in their paid models, still collect user data. Why? To improve their services. So I guess we are getting there, but it's up for people to build and choose to use those services.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for this comment. And sadly, although the discussion could go on for many hours, we are running out of time. So I would like to thank all the panelists for the yeah. And
to continue a discussion, there is actually another workshop on terms of service as cyber regulation taking place in room 2, starting at 4.
Yes, so that at 4, so that it will deal not only with platforms but also with infrastructure and content. If you're interested, you're all invited, and thanks a lot for your attention.